um, some people, when they're first learning about extracts, they feel put off by the hydrocarbon extracts because they feel like there's a higher safety risk due to the solvent load in
Right.
there. So do you have any advice you could offer listeners that if they're worried about solvents in a product, what sort of levels should they sort of be looking for? What's typical in a, I mean, ideally in a well purged extract, you maybe wouldn't have anything detectable or very, very low parts per billion. But what are your
Mhm.
thoughts on that if someone asked you,
Yeah.
like, what's a safe exposure
So
level?
the first thing that everyone should do is the first thing I mentioned in this interview. Go read the MSDS
Yeah.
for the solvent that you're wondering about, first of all, because the health risks that are associated with it are going to be on that sheet, and it gives a range. So
Yeah.
that gives you the acute exposure range, the like, moderate, or the persistent exposure. And you want to see what your best and worst case scenarios are. That acute exposure of 200 parts per million butane in your product is largely non-harmful. Just breathe fresh air, you're fine.
Right.
And that day-to-day exposure of over 5,000 parts per million for 8 hours at a time or longer does lead to dizziness and some other issues. And so you want to see the best and the worst. You want to see how much of this is it going to take for nausea versus pass out versus stroke and seizure.
Right.
Like you want to know what the actual ranges are, and that information is not a secret and it's not up for debate.
Yeah.
Like for those solvents to exist and be used, that information has been studied. Now it hasn't necessarily been studied for how hot of a dab you're going to take at home and how many grams you're going to smoke per day. These applications aren't necessarily standard, but our human exposure from inhalation or ingestion has been studied for these solvents to actually be sold and be legally allowed for us to use in extraction. Licensed labs can't use solvents that haven't been tested in that way.
Right.
So that data exists, and I would encourage everyone to go read it right away, because it's easy for us to all have opinions about the parts per million limit, and a lot of those are based on state regulations, which were formed from
Right.
the opinions
Yeah.
of people
Yep. Yeah.
with
Sometimes they're
no
pulled.
specific
Yeah.
criteria.
Yeah. Sometimes they're pulled from really weird places. Yeah.
Right. And so those numbers are not based on human studies. Those numbers are not based on, known and proven and, calculated potential harm. They're just numbers. They have, about as much data behind them as the safe speed limit for a road.
Yeah.
Like maybe 35 is safe in your car, and maybe in my car 45 is safe, and maybe with my mom driving my car 45 isn't safe. Like maybe there's more variables than just that number. So it's hard to rely on that, because you're going to see a really wide range. And so the state of Massachusetts says 10 parts per billion is what's safe for butane. And, the state of Oregon says 5,000 parts per million
Right.
is the safe amount. And neither of them are in charge of how much is actually safe for you and your body. And so the numbers are a very difficult one to compare. Obviously, we want to remove as much of those solvents as we possibly can. However, most of these solvents like butane, propane, CO2, and ethanol are food safe products. When we get into things like pentane and hexane and heptane,
Yeah.
or some of the compounds that are being used for conversions like iodine or toluene, like we've got some more significant health risks. And so, and those actually are more common in like CBD products where there's no regulation. Scarier issue that we could get into later.
Yeah.
But for the most part, you're going to have those solvents that are used listed on the label, and so you can do a quick MSDS check and read what the best and worst could possibly be, and then compare that to the parts per million, and we can put that math together, and we can say 5,000 parts per million for 8 hours a day of exposure to butane is what the MSDS recommends as being dangerous enough to actually make you ill and make you dizzy. And so if you are smoking a product that has 5,000 parts per million in it, don't smoke it for 8 hours a day.
Right.
Because, like now we can start to at least say, okay, well, that's something that, a dab at a time might add up to that acute exposure of,
Right.
however many parts per million. Every time we flick our lighter, that's about, 5,000 parts per million briefly. And so we're being exposed to butane and propane. It's in your air. CO2 is in your air. Ethanol is in almost every flavored food product
Right.
you eat.
Yeah.
So like anything that has artificial colors probably contains ethanol, so like a lot of these solvents exist. It's not realistic to fear them. And it is really important to judge them with math.
Yeah.
Like you've got to pay attention to how much is there. There's a big difference between 20,000 parts per million of butane and, 20.
Right.
And so you want to pay attention to those numbers as best you can. But I would also encourage anyone, especially anyone who's smoking concentrates, to listen to their body, because the solvents themselves are known, are studied, and are tested for. What we cannot provide to people right now is a comprehensive look at the potential conversions that are happening, the byproducts of some of this exposure.
Yeah.
Just heating up a solution that's extremely, high pH in ethanol that contains a lot of water could create some, converted byproducts that become really dangerous.
Yep.
Using iodine for conversions is, efficient to a certain extent, but it creates a bond with cannabinoids that isn't tested for. And now we have a cannabinoid compound that has been bonded with a little bit of iodine, and that can get to your brain, and that could probably end your life. We don't know, but that's not something that would be tested for.
Right.
And so the risks around these solvents, are the greater concern. And since we can't necessarily apply a lot of data to that right now, listen to your body. If it hurts to smoke, stop it.
Yeah. Yeah. No,
if it's uncomfortable, if it makes you feel weird, don't keep doing it. There are so many options out there that you should, listen to, the cues that your own physical chemistry is giving you. For the most part, like our instincts are generally right. And, even terpenes can degrade to benzene.
Yep.
So, like our favorite parts of cannabis could kill us.
Yeah, exactly.
So you've got to, be as educated as you can about the solvents. You don't have to know everything about extraction, but in the same way that you would look up a hormone that's added to your milk, you could look up a solvent that's used in your extraction, and then just pay attention to what your body tells you.
Yeah.